as an Indigenous woman and auntie. I say unique because I am one of approximately 35 Native Americans in the United States with a PhD in archaeology. I am also one of about 8 Navajo citizens with a PhD in anthropology. My perspective and the work that I've been a part of has been a very culturally grounded approach where I've learned knowledge about ceremonial and sacred aspects of our history and, of course, of our landscapes. I want to take you on my journey moving from the researcher to the research, or from the research to the researcher, a journey that not many Indigenous people make due to the terrible history between Indigenous peoples and archaeologists. I have also been educated in my own community and by other Diné about the taboo nature, or more specifically, the destructive aspect of archaeology. And I've also been called all sorts of names, some funny, such as a ghostbuster, and some not so funny, such as a chindi, or a sort of a ghost, or, in the same line. So funny and not so funny by Indigenous peoples after learning that I'm an archaeologist. However, I really want to share another dimension of my journey. After all, Indigenous peoples are multidimensional. And that's really what I've learned and how I've learned to braid my cultural and ancestral knowledges with my archaeological knowledge to enhance and strengthen my research, my service, and support of Indigenous communities and students in a very unique way. In a way that honors our ancestors, that assists our current communities, and that supports our future generations. So thank you again for joining me for this talk, and relax and listen as I take you on my journey. As Indigenous peoples, we have a strong sense of relationality. That is, over time, we have learned to respect, acknowledge, and honor the relationships that we have established, maintained, and nurtured through ceremony, prayers, offerings, and songs. The ancestral and cultural knowledges that are passed down and that are taught to each generation are also known as land-based learning or land-based pedagogies. In respecting our relationships with the land and in honoring the Indigenous peoples who are the caretakers of these homelands, of their homelands, we use land acknowledgements as protocol to remember and to respect the knowledges that have helped us to survive and to thrive. Additionally, land acknowledgements are one of the first steps of decolonizing. They recognize and acknowledge the deep connections that Indigenous peoples have and have maintained since time immemorial. Decolonization is the work of everyone. And I encourage each of you to investigate the lands that you occupy to reveal the hidden and often violent histories of the lands that you occupy. Here are some other questions that I'd like you to reflect on. Have you ever heard of a land acknowledgement? Do you know what a land acknowledgement is? Does your affiliated or former institution have a land acknowledgement? If it doesn't, why do you think that is? Start to ask those questions of yourself and of your institutions and begin to investigate yourself. You'll see that there are many different hidden histories that are often very sacred and very often turbulent histories for Indigenous communities. And so I want to begin with my institution's land acknowledgement for the lands that I currently live and from where I'm speaking from this evening, also known as Kinflena or as Flagstaff. So I am at this beautiful building here, the Native American Cultural Center on the beautiful campus of Northern Arizona University. And so NAU sits at the base of the San Francisco Peaks on homelands sacred to Native Americans throughout the region. We honor their past, present, and future generations who have lived here for millennia and will forever call this place home. There are 13 tribal nations that hold these lands to be sacred and whom still maintain a connection. Yeah. In honor of my own ancestors, I'd like to introduce myself in my own language, in one of my languages, Diné Asdzaa, or Navajo language. But first, I want to take a little bit of time and educate you as to why this is important to me and why this is an example of relationality. It's appropriate to introduce yourself to others in a cultural way when you're speaking from the heart. And in sharing the information that I'll be sharing with you this evening, I feel it's important and appropriate to bring my real self to you in this talk tonight. And so Bee Medicine, one of the first female Indigenous anthropologists, encouraged other Indigenous anthropologists to bring their real selves to the discipline and to academia as a way to share, educate, and enrich the academy. And so it's with this in mind that I want to share my own cultural introduction with you. I was taught that when I meet other Indigenous peoples, the information that I share really helps to provide the context for establishing relationality. For me, it's a way to honor the connections that we hold and that we share. And so in my Navajo introduction, I introduce where I come from, where my father comes from, my maternal grandfather and my paternal grandfather. And so that's what I'll be explaining, and I'll translate that after I'm finished. And so, Yat'e she'e Dr. Ora Marek-Martinez yinishe, Zithlani nishle, do nimi pui patise bashisching, do kis ani e dashiche, do belagane e dashinale, akut ego e sane nishle, Lapwe Idaho den yisi nasha, do kinflanite na shago. And so I introduced my mother. We are members of the Navajo Mountain Cove clan. My mother and my grandmother and my aunties that you see here in this bottom right-hand corner are all descendants of the Mountain Cove clan. And all of the women in my maternal line also come from Mountain Cove clan. My father is Nez Perce from northern Idaho, and the photo above is actually it's half of my family. So these are probably half of my first cousins in Lapwai, Idaho. And so my maternal grandfather is Hopi. He was from Third Mesa. My paternal grandfather was Bohemian and Italian, which is where Marek comes from. My pronouns are she, her, hers, Asdzaa, and Ayit, which is woman. I originally come from, and I was born in Lapwai, Idaho on a Nez Perce reservation, and so I have a map here of the reservation in the lime green. And so at the very end of that little line there where it says reservation is actually Lapwai, where I am from. The purple outline there is actually the cultural ancestral homelands of the Nez Perce people, and so we're affiliated with all of those areas. And so my the other map is a map of the Navajo Nation, and it also has a boundary line of our cultural landscape as well. And so originally my mom is from Shiprock, New Mexico, but my grandmother and grandfather settled here in Flagstaff, Arizona before World War II. They actually met at Belmont here, and my grandfather literally jumped the fence to be with my grandmother as a Navajo woman. He was Hopi. And so that's how my family came to be here in Flagstaff, and they've been here ever since. And so Flagstaff is also my second home, a very important place to me. And so one of the things in thinking about where I'm from and how this has sort of influenced my growth as an archaeologist and really my interest in becoming a researcher is really about, again, where I come from and the teachings that I received. And so my father was a very culturally grounded man in his Nimipu or Nez Perce culture. And so that is, of course, where his family is from, was actually from northeastern Oregon in the Wallowa area. And so my father, though, after the Nez Perce War of 1877, his family was placed on the reservation, and so that's where he grew up. And so he lived in various places throughout the Pacific Northwest. But he actually went to Haskell Indian University, where he met my mother And that's how I came to be in all of my intertribal fabulousness. And so a lot of people always wonder where a Navajo woman gets a Bohemian last name, and that's where it comes from. So, but my father was raised amongst his family, his uncles and his aunties, in a way to learn about the land and learn what it means to be a Nez Perce. And so what he taught to my siblings and I was this ancestral and cultural knowledge that was developed over thousands of years. And so this knowledge, of course, was gained through trial and error that not only helped us survive, but again, it helped us survive or thrive as Indigenous peoples. And so Gerald Visner, he describes this as survivance. And really, that's the ability of Indigenous peoples to survive, but also to succeed in the face of colonization and discrimination. And also being able to move beyond these sort of simple characteristics and stereotypes of who they are, and really being able to engage in and perpetuate their ancestral and cultural knowledges. And so, again, when I talk about multidimensionality, that's sort of what I'm speaking about, are all of these things that Indigenous peoples have grown into and have adapted into after all of the historical trauma and issues that our people have gone through. And so survivance was something that was ingrained in my family, and something that I believe is part of every Indigenous person's blood memory, right? It's something that goes from us from one generation to the next. So it teaches us to be proud, but it also gives us the knowledge and the connection to be able to survive, right? And again, to succeed and to understand what those connections are with our landscape. And so growing up in such a way where I was taught what it means to be a Nez Perce woman, to understand the landscape, what it means to be in service of your community, I was taught and I experienced and witnessed what it meant to love, to nurture, and to care for your community. And so those are some of the ethics that I bring into the work that I do, into the research that I do. And so the approach that I take to my research is really with my tamina, or my heart. And so I speak, I think, and I act from my heart. And so that helps me to ensure that I'm being true to who I am, to my core, but it's also ensuring that I'm doing things in a good way, or in a way that's beneficial for Indigenous peoples, but also is creating pathways for our youth and our people. And so in thinking about the work that I do, right, that kind of educational support system, I was taught the roles and responsibilities of what it meant to be not only a Nimipu'aya, but a Diné Asdzaa, a woman, an Indigenous woman, and what that meant for myself, my family, my community, and also my nation. And so I learned about the importance of reciprocal relations with each other, but also with our land and our, what you would call our elements, our other relatives. I also learned how to maintain and nurture the unique and special relationship that my people have held with the cultural landscape through prayers, offerings, and songs. And so these are all aspects of archaeology, of my cultural teachings, that have become an integral part of what it means to do Indigenous archaeology and what an Indigenous research paradigm looks like for me. And so the stories that I was told, the stories that I hold inside of me, they've all helped to shape my perceptions of the past and of what our ancestors and their belongings mean. And so the lessons that I was taught and what was stressed by our community helped me understand my role as a scholar and advocate, but also as an archaeologist. And, you know, in the world of indigenous archaeology, these concepts are not separated in any way. And as I've moved along in my journey, I've moved into this space of being this sort of youth and a niece or a nephew into an auntie. And so that has a whole other set of responsibilities that I'll talk a little bit about here. And so my cultural education, like I said, played a major role in my career choice, as well as my strong sense of service for my people. As an Indigenous woman, I have been prepared for this role by my own community. Growing up, I was taught by my mom, my aunties, and my grandmothers about what it means to be a woman, what it means to be a strong leader and the backbone of our people. But it really meant being able to care for, to nurture, and to protect our people, our relatives, and our lands. But part of that was ensuring the perpetuation of our ancestral and cultural knowledges and understandings for the next 7 generations. And so there again, there's that responsibility that I have. And so part of this education for me specifically included my motherhood teachings and what it means to be a mother. And so, and thank you, Megan, as she provided in the introduction, I am a proud mother. And so here's a photo of my family there, and you can see my little fur baby there in the very corner of the photo. But they keep me busy, but they also motivate me to do these things in a way that furthers these connections, that makes these kinds of teachings and this knowledge available to those who are seeking it. And so all of these photos actually represent my family, and for me as a Diné woman, it's always important that we start our journeys with the very beginning. And for me, my beginning are my homelands. And so that's why I started with a photo of where I come from. And so this photo, though, is where my cultural education comes from, where that love and that nourishment comes from. And so this is a photo of myself as a child. And of course, it's not a native baby photo without the Pendleton in the background. So I have to show that. And of course, all of my siblings also have their baby photos on the same Pendleton. So keeping it in the family. The next photo is a photo of my father and myself in the cradle board that both him and my mother worked on together. The next photo is a photo of my mom and my dad. And so this was at the Nez Perce National Historical Park. My dad was a cultural liaison for the Nez Perce tribe and was always taking me along on a lot of his duties. And so I like to think that, being an archaeologist and anthropologist has sort of been a part of my journey since I was that young. And there I am, sort of being a tough girl, throwing up my dukes. So, the next photo to the very bottom left is my siblings. And so I'm the second oldest. And so my family, like I said, is an integral part of who I am. And we are extremely close in Navajo culture. In fact, my sisters are the little moms to my children. And so they also teach my children and help me. And so our family is very close that way. And there's my husband in the background. So he's a strong enough man to deal with all of us strong Native women. Let's see. Okay. And in thinking about that, though, and where I come from and who I am, this next part of my journey is really about me becoming Dr. Ora Marek-Martinez. So, my journey started when I was young. I knew that I wanted to be an archaeologist when I was 10 years old. My father, like I said, was a cultural liaison, but he was also very culturally grounded, and he would take my siblings and I to different archaeological sites and cultural places on the Nez Perce Nation, but also throughout the Pacific Northwest, and he would tell us about our family and where our band moved in these different areas and why we were connected to these places. And so I always grew up with a strong sense of history and knowing who I am and understanding that the stories that my dad was telling about his family not only helped me understand who I am and where I come from, but that they would at one point sustain me and help to pull me forward in my own journey. And so, you know, like I said before, there are not very many Indigenous folks who are archaeologists, and that has to do a lot with the extractive nature of archaeology, the destructive nature, and the fact that archaeology is intimately tied to colonization and imperialization. And so, my choice to become an archaeologist was not an easy one. I knew that I wanted to help our people. I knew that I wanted to protect our sacred places, our cultural places, but I actually didn't know that was archaeology. And so that wasn't a journey that I took until I was here at NAU as an undergrad. And so all of these photos, really starting with the one in the bottom right hand corner, um, reflect my journey as an archaeologist. I started working for the Navajo Nation Archaeology Department as a student archaeologist in 1999. We had a branch office, a branch office here that was actually the student training program. And so it provided Navajo and other Native American students with on-the-job training, and employment opportunities. And so it was my opportunity to help my people, but also to really learn what it meant to do contract archaeology, but what it also meant to serve my people in a different way than I had imagined. Um, and so going through the student training program at NAD, Navajo Nation Archaeology Department, really opened my eyes to the need for Indigenous archaeologists, and the need for Indigenous perspectives in creating the narratives of our past. I think one of the things that we have to reckon with as archaeologists is that, in fact, we are all storytellers, and that oral histories are not that different than the archaeological narratives or the stories that are created by archaeologists. And so I think when we come to terms with that, and begin to work a little bit better, collaborate a little bit better, we'll be able to move our field forward. And so, again, coming from a very culturally grounded education and background, moving into archaeology and learning what I did about archaeology, it was a very conflicted sort of time for me. It was a very divisive sort of education where my cultural education and who I was as a Diné Asdzaa, as a Nihookaa, was questioned. And so it took a lot of strength for me to go through my education, but also to remain strong to who I am and what I understood. And so when I graduated from NAU with my bachelor's, I moved into the master's program here at NAU, and it really opened my eyes to the need for Indigenous peoples in archaeology and anthropology, but it also made me understand that I was in for a battle. And so there, of course, are many different examples and stories that I have of naysayers or folks who just didn't like what I was saying. And the fact that I did have this cultural grounding and was working with community. And so I've always, in a way, had my research and who I am challenged as an Indigenous woman. But that's only made my journey and my scholarship and my education all that much better. It's forced me to really stay on top of the game. It's forced me to keep two steps ahead. But in thinking about where I've come and what I want to do, I feel like I've been able to come full circle. When I first started out in archaeology, there were very few Indigenous archaeologists. And so, in fact, the second photo here, is a group of other Indigenous women who are archaeologists, and we all started at NAU at the same time. I think there are two of us who are still archaeologists. The other two have moved out of archaeology, but we still remain friends to this day. And it's interesting to hear their stories as well. And so I'm always thankful for the relationships that I have and the connections that I've made throughout my education, because it's those relationships that help sustain me and that motivate me to keep going. And so, without the help of my family, but also my academic family, so that middle photo is my academic mother, Dr. Margaret Conkey. She was someone who believed in me even when I didn't believe in myself. And so I have so much love in my heart for this woman because she opened my eyes to why I needed to be an archaeologist and why it was critical for Indigenous people to come into our field. And so I'm always thankful for Meg Conkey and her scholarship. She is actually one of the pioneers of feminist archaeology. And so she taught me a lot. And of course, it's those kinds of relationships that help to motivate us and keep us going. Let's see. Okay. All right. I just want to shift focus a little bit and tell you a little bit about my research and what I've done. And so, earlier I spoke about the legacy of archaeology and the distinct, I guess, relationship of archaeology and colonization here, especially in the United States. And so in thinking about that and how archaeology has served colonization, in applying that lens to the Southwest and the Navajo Nation, it's really opened my eyes as to how archaeology can really be utilized to change and to displace folks, especially Indigenous folks. And so if we were to refuse this legacy of colonization in archaeology, then we really need to change the way that we think about archaeology and understand that there are many different ways of understanding the past that aren't rooted in this sort of Western-based hypothetico-deductive reasoning, right? But that these other ways of knowing can also be rooted in an Indigenous epistemology or Indigenous life world. And there are Indigenous research paradigms that utilize decolonizing and Indigenous reasoning and approaches. And so, in thinking about this colonial agenda of disproving Indigenous stories and claims to locating the truth about the peopling of the world, this really created these kinds of hierarchies of the world's peoples. And so, we're very familiar with social anthropology and sort of those social hierarchies where oftentimes Indigenous peoples were seen as savages and sort of at the very bottom of this hierarchy, right, with others above them being more civilized. And so, in understanding how this has impacted Indigenous peoples, it created this sense of superiority and authority that created a sense of control over Indigenous folks or those who were beneath them in this social hierarchy. And so a lot of these ideologies became solidified as fact and became this kind of cultural archive, or really what we know as the canon of anthropological thought that we uphold, that we learn, and that we teach today. Those same kinds of colonial-based research paradigms classified, defined, and analyzed Indigenous peoples, their histories, and their cultures, which again also became the standard for determining cultural loss for Indigenous peoples. So that if we as Indigenous peoples did not practice or behave in the same way as our ancestors, we were losing our culture. So that we became this sort of perpetual disappearing Indian. And really, the perfect case study for the developing fields of anthropology. And so in this situation, non-Indigenous peoples became the experts and authorities on Indigenous life worlds and histories and pasts. And so our tribal homelands became the research labs for generations of anthropologists and archaeologists. In fact, this became so embedded in our consciousness as archaeologists and within our discipline that going into the field to study Native Americans or Native American pasts was and maybe still is a rite of passage for our discipline. And so, I want you all to think about that and how this has been perpetuated from this initial sort of development of our field and how that idea has been carried to where we are now. So much so that there is what Linda Tuhiwai Smith calls the Indigenous problem, where there are problems that are placed on Indigenous folks as justification to complete research, right? And so thinking about how problematic that is, and the way that research and archaeology specifically has been conducted. And so when we begin to move into these Indigenous research paradigms, we exercise relationality and we open ourselves to these other ways of knowing, it tends to change those patterns and those kinds of beliefs. And so in my area, in the US Southwest, the Navajo people, like I said, are a very interesting case. They, like many other tribes, were well researched and documented by early anthropologists and archaeologists. And their histories, their stories, and their culture were subject to these kinds of analyses, right? And interpretations that were steeped in settler colonial beliefs about Indigenous peoples. So much so that these stereotypes of Indigenous peoples then become fact. And so, in thinking about early 19th century ethnographic interviews and linguistic studies and archaeology that was completed, all of that was essentially used to prove that Navajo people were not in the Southwest until the 1700s. And so Indigenous cultural knowledge and connections to the land were then invalidated by those kinds of interpretations. But it's all those kinds of interpretations have created epistemological and real life implications for Indigenous peoples, and specifically for Navajo people. And so in thinking about also real life implications to that kind of colonial informed or based practice for Indigenous peoples, it's critical for us as a discipline to decolonize our research and begin to work with and by Indigenous peoples to learn about their pasts. And in addition to some of those real life implications, we see, or for example, we see the loss of land, the loss of different kinds of rights, such as water rights, mineral rights. But there's also impacts to cultural and ceremonial retention. And because access is denied or limited for these kinds of practices, for ceremonies to happen, or for offerings to happen, it prevents that transmission of knowledge from one generation to the next. And so there again, there's that real life implication of archaeology in that kind of colonial based research that we're used to seeing. And so there are also cultural implications that I've talked a little bit about. And so archaeology is really seen as taboo to Navajo folks. And it's not because of these sort of popular ideas of why archaeology is taboo, but really our archaeological sites are ancestral places. Those are places where our ancestors are at rest, where their belongings have been put at rest. And for us to disrupt that and to disturb that creates this sort of imbalance in the energy that's there. And if you are not trained or if you have no knowledge of what that means, then you have the potential to hurt a lot of different people. And so in that way, archaeology has become taboo for us as Navajo people, but also because it destroys these places. It pulls our ancestors out of the ground and puts them in museums. It puts them in institutions to study. And so of course, those kind of extractive, destructive practices are going to be taboo. And so we, as Indigenous peoples, though, we have autonomy, we have self-determination and sovereignty to engage in an archaeology that is with, by, and for our own people. And so, in thinking about how this has impacted our people, the the way that archaeology has been carried out has literally displaced Navajo people from their own homelands. The Navajo people, if you look at the archaeological story that's been created for the Navajo people, they are not connected to the Southwest until the 1700s. But our oral histories, our ceremonial histories, those tell us otherwise. They tell us of those deep and ancient connections that we have with this landscape. And so it puts us in a position of having to value indigenous knowledge or Western archaeological knowledge. And for a really long time, hundreds of years, indigenous knowledge has not been valued. And so I hear a lot of our elders speaking about the impacts to our people. And in a way, as part of indigenous archaeology, we're trying to reverse that. We're trying to bring that back into our lives, to reenact and re-engage with that cultural and ancestral knowledge in ways that benefit us. And so in thinking about what this means for indigenous peoples, right, for Navajo people and for many other tribes, there's no distinction between natural and cultural resources. And so the way that we understand the world dictates our relationship with the environment. And so, like I said, there's relationality, and the way that we observe that is we understand that we have relationships with everything. And this diagram shows that. It shows our connection to our past. It shows our creation story. It shows the cultural landscape, but it also shows the universe and how our deities are also a part of us. They are a part of this universe with us. And so in Navajo culture, when you do something, it impacts every single other person. And your words have power. And so you have to be mindful with how you act and with what you say, because your words have power. And so in thinking about that and what it means for archaeology and heritage management, one of the ways that we're able to engage in sovereignty and this kind of autonomy is being able to protect our tangible and intangible aspects of our cultural heritage. So not only our ancestral places, but also our songs, our prayers, things like that we can't necessarily touch. But it was also intergenerational learning. So it was enacting that land-based pedagogy. It was learning on the land again and teaching that the way that it has been taught for thousands of years. And so because we are adapting, because that's part of who we are as indigenous peoples, we've learned to braid knowledges. And so by braiding our indigenous knowledges with our archaeological knowledge, for example, that only strengthens what we know about the past and what we can know about the past. And so then it becomes being able to educate the next generation of caretakers and stewards and archaeologists in a way that reconnects all of us and observes and respects these kinds of relationships. As part of my dissertation research, I explored how to create an archaeology with, by, and for the Navajo people. And so for me, I wanted to see if there was a possibility to reconcile these seemingly very disparate kinds of knowledges and approaches to understanding the past. And so I listened to our elders, our leaders, our traditional knowledge carriers, and our communities, and I asked them what they wanted to learn about the past and what was the value that they saw in archaeology and learning about the past. And really what I heard surprised me. And so although archaeology is taboo for our people want to learn more about the past. And they understand that archaeology is a tool that can strengthen the knowledge that we have, that our elders have, that's a part of our protocols and our ceremonies. And so when I started to think about these things and what our people want, because indigenous archaeology is really about helping our people, being with, by, and for our Navajo people, with our Indigenous people. And so they told me that archaeology is not the only way to learn about the past. And I had to remember that. And so that was something that, put me in check as an archaeologist, but also it reminded me of how much knowledge our people have and how much knowledge is contained in our creation stories, in our ceremonial songs, in our prayers. And so I had to sort of deconstruct my own understanding of what it meant to understand the past, and then really all of these other areas open to me, these other avenues of investigating the past open to me. And so what I understood and what I heard is that our people are different, each of our communities are different, and they want to be the ones to tell the story of their community. And so, I understood. I heard loud and clear that for thousands of years, Navajo people have told their own histories. They've told their own stories. They know their past, but they wanted to learn in a different way. And using archaeology could help them learn in this different way. And so for me, it became then, okay, how do we make these work together, and how do we braid these together in a way that is beneficial for communities and our people, but also for us as archaeologists, right? And so one of the ways that I saw this working was to indigenize archaeology and to decolonize archaeology. But more specifically, Indigenous archaeology is about local context. It's about the specific community and learning about that community and braiding that knowledge with archaeological knowledge, right? Approaches even. And so what I learned is that by working with our knowledge carriers, our elders, our Hatatli, they provided me with the information, and others that I work with, to create a cultural affiliation statement. And so we were able to create a temporal sequence of what it meant to what our history was. And so we had a way to describe our history. We had the very beginning of what a research design would look like for the Navajo Nation from a culturally informed perspective. And surprisingly, it was similar to the Pecos classification, which, threw me for a loop, I'll be honest. I was expecting something very different, but in terms of the descriptions and some of the diagnostic features, it's very similar. And so again, I think by braiding these knowledges, braiding these stories together, it only enhances our understanding of the past. And so I want to share very quickly with you some of the things that we learned working through the process of creating a cultural affiliation statement was that we have acknowledged as Navajo Nation that the Navajo people have an affiliation with prehistoric Anasazi, or what we refer to as Nihookaa, our ancestors, our ancient ones. And that relationship is based on clanship and kinship relations. There are 70 clans that Navajo have and hold, but there are 10 that are recognized as being affiliated with Nihookaa. And so that is where our affiliation to these different archaeological places, our ancestral places, comes from. That's where it's rooted in our cultural understanding, our cultural knowledge. And so that relationship then is based on our oral histories, but it's also based on anthropological literature and other literature that we've collected as Navajo people since the very beginning of anthropology and archaeology starting on our lands. And so those histories and the landscapes and archaeological sites, our ancestral sites, are described in our ceremonies and are an integral part of our ceremonial cycle. And because of all of those things, we recognize our connection to the ancient past here in the Southwest. And so I feel like it's important for people to know that there is a very intricate understanding and details that accompany this knowledge that describe our connection. And so a lot of this knowledge was kept internally until we were told by a group very specifically to start telling people and sharing this information because it's critical. And so I am sharing this knowledge with you all because I feel like it helps us to understand that our Indigenous knowledge can be combined with archaeological knowledge in a way that is beneficial for all of us involved. And so in thinking about this, this is what I've created as my own sort of research agenda and approach. And so really, though, this is based on the work of Linda Tuhiwai Smith and the work that I completed from my own community, with my own community, and really what I have created as part of the Navajo research paradigm, or Diné research paradigm. And this is part of what helped us to create this Nihookaa Diné Ashdlái'I archaeology, or the archaeology of the five-finger or surface people, of who we really are. And so this research paradigm is based in our Diné life worlds, and that knowledge is a representation of a ceremonial approach or a protocol to investigating the past, but in a way that really integrates and braids Navajo ways of being and thinking. And so I just want to talk about this very quickly. So this diagram is really based on our ceremonial knowledge and protocol, because the information that is learned about our ancestors is considered sacred. There's a protocol for how one interacts and engages with this information. And so I had to think very carefully about what that meant to hold that knowledge, and why we need to be careful, and why we need to take these very directed steps. And so essentially, this is the Navajo scientific method. And so because we always start in the East, we start here in the East. And so we always proceed in a sunwise direction, where we sort of greet the sun. And so then it moves south, west, north, and back to the east. And so, in the East, it's also associated with different stages of our life. And so the East is the very beginning, it's our infancy, but it's also where we're developing these very important skills, the imagination and critical thinking. But it's here that we begin to really believe in ourselves. We're open to receiving knowledge and information, but we're also at this point beginning to form a pattern and a habit, and we're starting to think about our future. And so we move to the South, where we are sort of young adults, right? We're still a little carefree. We're starting to prepare ourselves. We're starting to plan and strategize. But our ancestral knowledge, our cultural knowledge, is always at the foundation of whatever we do. That's always at the very foundation. And so researcher and home fire in the middle represents that foundational knowledge of where we are and how our culture roots us and anchors us, grounds us, really. And so we move to the West, where we are adults, where we have learned to collaborate and cooperate with one another. There's a sense of respect and humor, but there's also that work ethic of doing things. You act on it. It's up to you only to do these things. But also at this point, we've learned what it means to love one another, to love ourselves. But also we know compassion. We know how important it is to nurture ourselves and to be mindful. And so when we think about that, right, we're at a really good place in our life, and this is actually where all the research happens. This is where everything hits the road here. And then finally, we move to the North, where we're elders, there's wisdom there, there's reflection, there's time for reflection, but also we start to evaluate and think about that process. Is there anything that we could have done different? Is there anything that we can do better? But at this point too, we should also be familiar enough with the protocols, the cultural grounding in order to help us go another round. And so again, this is a cycle. This doesn't ever end, it continues. And so you'll see that there are the hogan in the on the outside, and those are actually different action steps. And so there's the researcher. You have to prepare yourself to receive this knowledge. Knowledge like this that you learn in archaeology is sacred. You have to prepare yourself. You go through ceremony, you protect yourself. But also you, in the next stage, you have to learn what it means. You have to participate. You have to put yourself out there. And when you do that, you gather information. People share things with you to help you get better. And then finally, because you have all of that knowledge, you can give back. You can help other people. And so again, it's something that is a continuation. And it represents not only our hogan, but our homelands. And so part of this too, the four directions are our four sacred mountains. And so when I spoke earlier about multidimensionality, that's what you have to think of, is that this is always moving, it's always changing, but there are steps, there are concrete steps that we take. So again, this is our scientific method, if you will. Okay. Just really quickly, the work that I'm doing now is really centered on reconnecting Indigenous narratives to our homelands, right? And so for me, this is really combining Indigenous archaeology and Indigenous futurisms. And that's created an opportunity that has never existed for Indigenous people since contact. Our histories, our identities, our presence has been designed and created and classified by anthropologists and archaeologists for over 200 years. That's something that has never been in our hands. But Grace Dillon, who is a scholar who is invested in Indigenous futurisms, made a statement about Indigenous futurisms that really bears true for archaeology, and why I've had to or learned to integrate these two together to braid that knowledge. And so she says that the movement's popularity grows from an emerging sense that Western science has lost something vital by isolating itself from spiritual origins in a quest to achieve objectivity. When we look for sciences that model the inextricable union of the metaphysical and the measurable, Indigenous futurisms offer new ways of reading our own ancient natures. And so for me, that means using our ancestral and cultural knowledges to pull us and to propel us forward. That doesn't mean that we're trying to get back to a point in the past. It means we're using that knowledge to help ourselves and to push ourselves into the future. And really, that's why Indigenous archaeology has been so important for me. It's provided this pathway for Indigenous communities to engage in sovereignty in cultural heritage work. And so that means that they're able to protect their homelands in ways that are culturally appropriate and that respect who they are and their local knowledge. And so when you conduct work in that way, you're doing things not only in a culturally appropriate way, but in a way that's sustainable, in a way that the community can keep up, because it's them, they are the ones that are going to have to maintain that responsibility. It's not us as archaeologists who come back to the academy and move on to another project. It's that community. And so understanding that and respecting that is this change that I've been trying to advocate. And so, in braiding Diné knowledge and with archaeological science, and using Indigenous archaeology and Indigenous futurisms, I have been able to use Diné knowledge to guide archaeological research. I've been able to create community-based training programs, but also in doing these things, it's utilize these very specific practices. And so intergenerational learning, oral history, storytelling, story work, in all those ways that mean something to the community. And so in thinking about what that means and in envisioning Indigenous futurities, it's in thinking about my own work with the Navajo Nation, we've really striven to take these steps to engage sovereignty in our cultural heritage work, which has really proven to be beneficial. And so in the work that I did with Navajo Nation previously, the archaeologists that work for the nation have integrated their cultural knowledge in research, but also in tribal code and how to identify sites. What is a site? They've been able to integrate their knowledge and to braid that so that sites and places that are important to Navajo people are protected. Because we all know that the legislation and the regulations that exist at a national level very rarely protect sites that are on tribal homelands. And so the Navajo Nation has utilized their sovereignty and leveraged it in a way that they're able to protect what's important for them, in addition to other places that are important to other communities. And so I think it's important to preface that as well. And so, in thinking about how we can assert these different areas, this sovereignty, part of that means growing the next generation of researchers by creating these opportunities. And so the work that I've done here at NAU, and so the photos that you see on the left hand and in the middle are all representations of my work with Indigenous students here in teaching them what it means to engage in heritage management, Indigenous heritage management. And so we were able to learn about other global Indigenous cultures while bringing folks here and also out visiting and creating these global alliances among students. And the other two photos, my work as the TIPO, Tribal Historic Preservation Officer, took me to testify against the United States and its lack of protections for traditional cultural properties and sacred places that are important to Indigenous peoples. And so we worked intertribally with the San Carlos Apache tribe, but also with the Laguna, Pueblo of Laguna, and Hopi tribe to testify and bring attention to some of the issues that we were facing together. And so by coming together and raising awareness, we were really able to sort of raise the bar. And so in thinking about how we do these things and how we regain that authority, it's by these alliances. It's, again, creating opportunities to teach and to share knowledge. And so the bottom photo there, the long one, those are all archaeologists and TIPOs from the Pacific Northwest that we engaged in started storytelling about what archaeology is on our own homelands or those homelands that we work for. And we're able to have a workshop and learn from one another and strategize and help one another. And so, again, taking advantage of these opportunities to help one another, but also leveraging our own Indigenous knowledges. And coming full circle back to NAU, part of my work is working as a director for the Native American Cultural Center. But also, my work, again, includes supporting and ensuring the success of the next generation of Indigenous leaders and advocates. And so part of my work then is creating a sense of belonging, but also educating faculty and staff and administrators here at NAU about what it means to be an Indigenous student in university. And so that has been a whole other adventure and probably another talk, a completely different talk. But it's also brought me to be very aware of local histories. One of the things that I've noticed and that has been brought to my attention is the lack of Indigenous presence here in Flagstaff, and that there is no connection historically for us. And so there's a lot of folks, students who come to NAU who think that there are no Indigenous peoples here. And so it has been my job now to educate and to really try to help people understand what those connections really mean. And so, in thinking about what it means to be an Indigenous archaeologist, but what it means to be an academic auntie, right? And what it means to braid knowledges and use my own Indigenous knowledge to help support the development and success of Indigenous students, not only at NAU, but also globally. In many ways, I've come full circle in my journey through academia. I began my academic journey many years ago at NAU as an undergrad, and here I am now helping Indigenous students like myself who sometimes don't quite know what to expect, but are nevertheless ready for the challenges and opportunities that lay before them. And so it's really been my responsibility, but also it has been something that has been amazingly fulfilling to help protect ancestors, to help our families and our communities, but also to help future generations in creating these new pathways to the future. And so I'm very grateful for the opportunity and the time to share my story. And so thank you, Katsiaia Ihehet. And if there are any questions, I'd be happy to take those. So.
Wonderful, Ora. Thank you so much. This is so great, and I'm just so humbled on behalf of Old Pueblo Archaeology. I just want to thank you again so much for being with us here tonight and just giving us a lot of information, very unique sense and understanding, but also very important work. As I had mentioned before we started, is very motivating for me to hear and to see these words that you're speaking and you're writing about, because they are impactful, from generations that are now here listening to you to the future ones that are yet to be here. And I just really am taking it all in, and thank you so much. And I would just like to open up some of the questions and comments sections if anyone has any questions or anything anyone would like to share with or Dr. Marek-Martinez. I see a hand up, actually.
So
Anita Hicks.
really quickly, so sorry about that. That's actually the rain that's hitting my window. So
Yeah.
that's the knocking sound. I apologize for that.
Yeah, no typewriters anymore.
I wish I had a typewriter.
Yeah, right.
Sorry,
So
Anita, yeah.
no problem. Anita, if you want to maybe unmute yourself, or if you want to write down your question.
Anita, I just allowed you to unmute if you want to go ahead and speak.
Well, I'm not sure how to type a question. I just was interested in how she's managed to basically cover two very different philosophies. I'm not in the field at all. I'm just somebody who's interested. And so I'm really struck by and enlightened about your comments, basically about looking at dwellings or history all over the world, because I've never really thought about it in terms of the cultural impact. I don't even have the words. I'm sorry, I'm struggling, but I was, I think I was enlightened. So thank you for that.
Oh, well, thank you so much, Anita. I really appreciate your insights and your observations. And you're right. There was a lot of conflict, and there was a lot of uh, I don't even know what the word is really, but there was a lot of it for me when I first started out. I started archaeology in the 1990s, and so in the post-NAGPRA era, where it was very much divisive and very binary. And so, in learning and seeing all of those things happening, I realized that our field had a long ways to go. I came from a very culturally grounded upbringing, right? And so my father was very adamant about that I understood where I come from and who I was, and that I, had the knowledge to protect myself and to become and to be a woman and a mother, but also a caretaker of our ancestors. And so that was one of the kinds of knowledge that my father imparted to me before he passed. And it hasn't been without its sore spots and its difficulties, because it has been. And for me, when I didn't quite understand what it meant to be an archaeologist until I went into Archaeology 101 and started hearing these theories of the peopling of the Americas, right? And that these theories were in direct contradiction of what I knew and understood of how my people came to be here. And so it was, again, very difficult for me to go from this culturally grounded understanding and then having to write papers and conduct research that supported these views, and that literally was telling me that everything about my family, everything that they told me, was a lie, right? And so what I had to do was decolonize my own thinking and really change the way that I understood archaeology in general. And for me, that was with Linda Tuhiwai Smith's Decolonizing Methodologies. That book opened my eyes to understanding how research has been utilized as a justification to creating these historical situations and instances that Indigenous peoples have been put through. And so once I understood how research had been leveraged and justified in a lot of ways to support the displacement of our people, to silence our voices, and to literally tell us that our knowledge was myth, right? And it was superstition. I really had to look at the way, again, archaeology was being conducted, what questions were being asked, and why were we so concerned with who was here first. And so once I started to use my own understanding, my own cultural understanding, that we all, as Indigenous peoples and all peoples, have connections to specific places. We all have protocol, we all have ceremony, and it's not my place to dictate who was first, because we can never know that. Literally, we can never know that. And so, right, part of that then is understanding that there are many different connections, there are many different ways of understanding the past. And when we look at it now, where we are, it's all contextual. And so I think as archaeologists, we have to sort of move beyond having one true narrative. We have to open ourselves to having many strands, many multiple strands of what the past may have been. Because again, we will never fully know. We just have pieces of information from various sources, right? And so again, archaeology has always been story work. It has always been storytelling. Interpretation is literally storytelling. And it is no different than what my ancestors did thousands of years ago to be able to survive. And so I think for me, that's what it came down to, is understanding that archaeology is storytelling. And there are different methodologies for nailing down a time, but it's all relative. That's one thing we all know, right? Time is relative. So it's all contextual. And so, thinking about that, it's difficult to get behind, but it also should open up your mind to embracing all of the knowledge that's out there. There's so much out there that can enhance what we truly know and what we actually know. And so why not open ourselves to being these great storytellers, to allowing ourselves to imagine what that would be. And so that's, as Indigenous peoples, that's who we are now. We are taking control of that ability to dream these futures for ourselves, because that's something that has never been afforded to us. And so for me, it's those pieces that have allowed me to move beyond that kind of binary or even that kind of dichotomy, to sort of pushing that to the side and embracing all of these things. And it took me a really long time. Like I said, I started archaeology in '99, and that was as a student. I worked in museums before that. I saw what happened with NAGPRA. I saw all of these things that happened to my tribe, or to my father's tribe, the Nez Perce tribe, by way of going with my father. So I have a very intricate understanding of what archaeology had done to my people. And so now I feel like I'm in a place where I can teach that now, and I can share that knowledge and help others to overcome that kind of dichotomy and binary, to move beyond that. And so really that's where I am now, and I hope that helped.
I think that was very, very good, very well organized. So I'll go on to the next question from Claudia. This presentation is so important in educating non-Indigenous people about other ways of knowing about archaeological sites. How do you envision a dialogue between Indigenous archaeologists and present-day archaeologists whose careers have relied on non-Indigenous ways of knowing?
Yeah, actually, Indigenous archaeology is archaeology for everyone. You don't have to be Indigenous to do Indigenous archaeology. That's sort of the misnomer here. I just happen to be an Indigenous woman, and I fully embraced what Indigenous archaeology was. And so for me, when I think about Indigenous archaeology and the way that we do these things, it really is about opening yourself up to these other ways of knowing, right? And so one of those ways of knowing that is becoming very popular is land-based pedagogies, or land-based learning, right? And so going back to the land to learn. And so we're seeing this come up in a lot of different ways. We see a lot of schools that are having these programs now where they're taking children out and taking them on these walks to teach them about nature and these sort of symbiotic relationships, right? And so that is something for everyone. You don't have to be Indigenous to understand that or feel that, right? And so archaeology, and that's really what I love about that. Again, it comes back to story work. And so if we are all on the understanding that not one of us can know these things, but that we can help each other understand better, we can enhance each other's learning, then I think we're in a place where we don't have to worry about those things. It's really then we're moving beyond these kind of labels to fully embracing other lines of evidence, if you will, right? And so it's really a shift in how we value information and how we value knowledge. And so my encouragement then is to non-Indigenous archaeologists to open themselves up. I challenge you to open yourself up to understanding relationality, what does it mean to be in relation with someone, right? What does it mean to be in relation with the land that you occupy? And so all of those things mean different things to each of us, right? And so for me as an Indigenous person, in order to honor the land that I'm on, I sing song, I go give offerings, right? I participate in ceremonies, and that's my way. And everybody else has different ways of being in concert with the land, or of having those connections with the land, right? So I think there are many different opportunities for non-Indigenous archaeologists to help. And in fact, there are a lot of different examples of non-Indigenous archaeologists who are very well-known Indigenous archaeologists, if you will. And so for them, though, they have opened themselves up to listening to knowledge carriers, not just elders or what's the word in English? Like our medicine people, I guess that's I guess that's the word I'm looking for. It's all of those folks, right? They're the ones who oh my gosh, I lost my train of thought. I'm so sorry. The medicine people got me going. I'm so sorry. But so going back to Indigenous archaeology, right? Some of those who are the biggest champions of Indigenous archaeologists are non-Indigenous archaeologists. And they're the ones who, through their own lived experience, have created these pathways for us, and have since moved out of the way and supported us so that we as Indigenous folks are able to say these things. We're able to bring our own connections into academia, because that, I think, was lacking for a really long time, were those connections. And so those of us who come from community, we have that knowledge to help and to guide folks and to help influence things. And so that, again, is another way. And so I think thinking about this, though, the relationship between Indigenous and non-Indigenous, it should always be based on reciprocity. How can we help one another? How can we learn from one another, right? And so I don't see it ever being limited. I see actually, these opportunities that are coming from these collaborations. So
That's great. Ronnie wrote, can you give us an example how you see something from the Indigenous point of view as opposed to the American way? Maybe of Chaco, Bear's Ears, Canyon de Chelly, or whatever you choose.
yeah. So I just want to clarify, when I use Western is not confined to a geographic location. It's really an ideology. And so it's something that really started in Europe in the Enlightenment and has carried on and sort of morphed into what we understand to be Western research, right? And so thinking about that, and so when I say specific, it's contextual, very locally specific, right? And so I'll give you an example from my perspective as a Navajo woman. And so Chaco Canyon is actually a really good example. So as a Navajo woman, my understanding of Chaco Canyon relates to the ceremonial history of what Chaco Canyon represents. And so we have oral histories of Chaco Canyon and who was there and what that place was used for. And so I'm not supposed to talk about it right now because it's outside of winter, but there might be some publications, but the Gambler, actually, I'll just mention their name. The Gambler is somebody who is associated with Chaco Canyon. And so for me, Chaco Canyon is a very important ceremonial place because it's an important part of our oral history. And it tells the story of our relationship with the Eastern Pueblos, with Hopi, and with some of our like Apache relatives as well. And so for me, it's a story about who and how we were together at one point, and how we became separate, and how we have to work with one another right now in protecting our landscape. And so for me, that's what Chaco represents. Bear's Ears is very similar, where it represents a place where our ancestors were. So they're not necessarily archaeological sites for me, they're ancestral places. They have the energy of our people there. Their songs are there, their prayers are there, right? And I think that's why all of us as human beings go to visit archaeological sites, because there's something that draws us there. There's that connection there. And for me, I have an understanding based on my culture, my oral history of what those places are. And so my understanding is very different than, say, a Hopi woman, or even a Hickory Apache, or, you know, a Southern Ute woman, because it's our context. It's how we were brought up. It's our knowledge. It's the songs and the stories and the ceremonies that are contained in those places. And so for each of us, it means something different. But that's, again, the beauty of these places, is that there's so much there. There's so much knowledge there. It's multi-layered, and it's multi-dimensional. It's so exciting to me.
Wonderful. Yes. Wow. So Susan wrote, are you encouraged by reestablishing of Bears Ears National Monument and formalizing the role of members of the tribal coalition that advocated for the monument in its management and protection?
Yes, I am. You know, I worked on Bears Ears when we were in the very initial phases. I was the TIPO for Navajo. And I can tell you it was really interesting being in a space with the other 5 tribal nations, and trying to talk about this and negotiate some of these different responsibilities. But it was unprecedented. It was something that we had worked for. It's something that we had talked about, we prayed for, and other folks prayed for. And so to see it being reestablished is phenomenal to us. But I think I have a little bit of concern in how and where the tribal authority is respected by the federal agencies. And so, you know, we'll see what happens down the road. But I think as long as tribes maintain their sovereignty and their ability to steward and care for Bears Ears and that homeland, in those homelands and that landscape, then, you know, I think we're moving in the right direction, you know, and it's something that definitely needed to happen. So
Yes, definitely. That's great. So then just a couple or 3 different comments from one from Maryland. Thank you, Dr. Ora, for the most in-depth presentation I've heard on the subject, which needs to be shared as a step forward toward a better future. Mary Grant, she wrote, this was wonderful to be able to listen to. Thank you very much. And Judy wrote, a very enlightening presentation. Thank you so much for sharing your knowledge and understanding of Indigenous archaeology with all of us. Yes, here, I agree. And just like I had said earlier, I'm just taking it all in, and I hope to help with this presentation and where this knowledge takes you and your team and the experts that you're training, the Indigenous students that are working with you. I hope all of us work together towards a balance, because it really is a sense of balance between us and Earth, and us and our places, our spaces, where our ancestors still remain. and we still remain. So it's all really, really important work, like I said, and I hope we all work towards that same balance to keep Earth going in the right direction, and all of us too.
Exactly. Oh, well, thank you so much, everyone. I really appreciate the opportunity and the time. And again, thank you for taking the journey with me. I always enjoy sharing my story, and it was a lot of fun. So,
Yes,
yep, thank you.
thank you. Wonderful. And then we'll go ahead and forward you the rest of the comments. I can read one more comment before we go, just to set you off on a really fantastic positive note from Monica. Thank you for sharing your personal story and journey and your unique expression of the scientific method. Your approach to balancing your academic and traditional learning is inspiring and has given me a clearer perspective in appreciating all aspects of an Indigenous people's history, traditions, and experience. You bring hope and understanding for the present and future.
Oh,
I hope.
thank you so much. I appreciate that.
Wonderful. Continue to connect, or continue to reach out to us, and we'll do the same.
Right. And I'm always open for further conversation. So look me up at NAU. I'm available if you have anything. I'm again always willing to talk more. So I love being an educator, and I take that to heart. So
Yes.
thank you, everyone.
Wonderful. Have a good evening, everybody. And if you think of it, please, if you think of us and donating to our Indigenous Interest Series, please do so. Thank you so much again for joining us this evening. Have a wonderful, safe rest of your week.
Bye.
Bye.